They'll take a procedural vote at 3 Eastern on whether to move forward with debate on the campaign finance bill. Republicans defeated a cloture vote yesterday, but Democrats kept the Senate in session late into the night to draw attention to the bill and are planning a second vote on the legislation today. Now our live coverage of the Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. God of grace and glory, you have already blessed us this day. We pause now to acknowledge that we borrow our heartbeats from you, and that because of you, we live and breathe and move and have our being. Continue to nourish and sustain this nation during these difficult and dangerous days. Thank you for the brave men and women in our armed forces and the members of their families who daily sacrifice to keep freedom's flame burning. Lord, surround our lawmakers this day with your spirit of reconciliation, that they may put aside that which brings division and embrace that which engenders unity. May your blessing and benediction enable our senators to work together in harmony and peace. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., July 17, 2012. To the Senate. Under provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Christopher A. Coons, a senator from the state of Delaware, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President Pro Tempore.
Mr. President, I now move to proceed to count number 446S3369.
Clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 446S3369, a bill to amend the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971, and so forth, and for other purposes.
For the information of all senators, the time until 12:30 today will be divided and controlled between the two leaders or the designees. Republicans will control the first 30 minutes, majority the second 30 minutes. We'll recess from 12:30 until 2:15 p.m. today to allow for weekly caucus meetings. At the time from 2:15 to 3 p.m. will be equally divided and controlled, and at 3 p.m. there will be a cloture vote on the motion to proceed to the Close Act, which was debated last night and will be debated again this morning. Mr. President, the corrosive effect of money on American politics isn't a product of the 21st century. More than 100 years ago, moneyed special interests had already tested the integrity of this country's political system. In 1899, copper billionaire William Clark was elected to the United States Senate by the Montana State Legislature. The contest was considered so blatantly swayed by bribery, the Senate refused to seat him. Here's how Clark responded, quote, "I never bought a man who wasn't for sale," end of quote. Now, Mr. President, we in Nevada have some connection with that name because Las Vegas is in Clark County. Clark County was formed in the early part of the 20th century. It was split between, at the time it was the largest county in America. It was called Lincoln County. And that was divided and between Lincoln and Clark County, and this character, Clark, was named after him. After he said this, and people realized that he had blatantly swayed the state legislature by bribery, the Senate here refused to seat him. But he became a senator anyway, Mr. President. Not for long, but he became a senator. As I learned from people who know a lot about Montana history, he was very clever. The governor of the state of Montana went to San Francisco, the acting governor, lieutenant governor, after he was denied his seat, reappointed him to the Senate. And so he got to the United States Senate by virtue of that shenanigan that took place. But since Montana voters went on to pass the Corrupt Practice Act via referendum, they voted for it. Less than a decade later, Republican President Theodore Roosevelt reined in unlimited corporate giving to political candidates at the federal level as well, not only in Montana but on the federal level. This nation has a long history of curtailing the corrupting influence of money in politics. But with its Citizens United decision, the Supreme Court of our country erased a century of effort to protect the fairness and integrity of American elections. That disastrous decision opened the door for big corporations, anonymous billionaires, and foreign interests to secretly spend hundreds of millions of dollars influencing voters. For anyone who dismisses this change as politics as usual, they should think again. During this year's election, outside spending by GOP shell groups is expected to top $1 billion. That's billion with a B. The names of these new front groups contain words that are warm and fuzzy, like freedom and prosperity. But make no mistake, Mr. President, there's nothing free about an election purchased by a handful of billionaires for their own self-interest. Just one of those outside groups, just one of them, backed by wealthy oil interests, has promised to spend $400 million on negative ads filled with half-truths and distortions of President Obama's record. By comparison, during the 2008 election, less than 4 years ago, Senator John McCain's presidential campaign spent $370 million total. That was a huge amount of money in that day, but it's being dwarfed by these outside groups this year. So this year's one group special interest money will dwarf the entire budget of the Republican nominee, John McCain, in the last presidential election. Democrats and the majority of Americans believe these unlimited corporate and special interest contributions should be outlawed. But in the post-Citizens United world, the least we should do is require groups spending millions on political attack ads to disclose the donors. We owe it to the voters to let them judge for themselves the attacks and the motivations behind them. But they can only do that if they know who's doing it. The Disclose Act would require political organizations of all stripes, liberal and conservatives alike, to disclose donations in excess of $10,000 if they'll be used for campaign purposes. Safeguarding fair and transparent elections used to be an arena where Democrats and Republicans could find common ground. As far back as 1997, the Republican leader, my friend Senator McConnell, said, quote, "Disclosure is the best disinfectant," end of quote. In fact, 14 Republicans now serving in the United States Senate voted to support stronger disclosure laws in 2000. Yet last night, those same 14 Republicans did an about-face. And every one of my Republican colleagues voted to block the Disclosure Act. It's obvious Republicans' priority is to protect a handful of anonymous billionaires willing to contribute hundreds of millions of dollars to change the outcome of elections. But today, again, they'll have an opportunity to consider that backwards priority. We're doing that with the motion to reconsider that I announced last night. And they have the opportunity to stand up for the average voter instead of these billionaires. I hope they join Democrats as we work to ensure all Americans, not just the wealthy few, have an equal voice in the political process.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
Last week, in response to another disappointing month of job growth, President Obama issued a truly bizarre ultimatum. A truly bizarre ultimatum. Let me raise taxes on 1 million businesses, or I'll raise taxes on everybody. Let me raise taxes on 1 million businesses, or I'll raise taxes on everybody. Yesterday, Democratic leaders in Congress took this strange new economic theory whereby politicians purport to help job creation by hurting job creators to dizzying new heights. Yesterday, Senate Democratic leaders said they would actually prefer to see America go off the so-called fiscal cliff this coming January, along with the trauma that would unleash on our economy, then let businesses maintain their existing tax rates. That was the position of Democratic leaders yesterday. They'd rather see America go off the fiscal cliff in January than let 1 million businesses maintain their current tax rates. It's an astonishing admission. An astonishing admission. Democrats in Congress are now saying that they would rather see taxes go up on every American at the end of the year than let about 1 million businesses keep what they earn now. Rather let taxes go up on everybody in the country rather than allow 1 million businesses to keep the money that they earn now. Madam President, this isn't an economic agenda. It's not an economic agenda. It's an ideological crusade. This morning, Ernst & Young is releasing a study which shows that President Obama's plan to raise taxes on these businesses will result in 710,000 fewer jobs. What a great idea. Let's raise taxes on 1 million of our most successful small businesses and eliminate 700,000 jobs in the middle of the most tepid recovery in anybody's memory. What a terrific idea. For those who manage to keep their jobs, real after-tax wages would fall by an estimated 1.8%, meaning living standards would decline as government sucks more capital out of the economy. The President's proposal, in other words, is a recipe for economic stagnation and decline. A recipe for economic stagnation and decline. But the Murray proposal, the idea that we should raise taxes on everybody, is even worse. Not only would it trigger another recession, it would put the global economy at risk. Now here's the Democratic theory, that a massive income tax increase on 140 million American taxpayers wouldn't be so bad because the effects wouldn't be felt right away. Wouldn't be so bad because the effects wouldn't be felt right away. This bizarre conclusion can only be reached by politicians and budget analysts who have never worked a day in the private sector, who don't understand what goes into cutting a paycheck for your employees, and who don't have a concept of the planning that is necessary when you are operating a business on thin margins in a tough economy. This shows how out of touch these people are. To rely on the analysis of Ivy Tower liberals instead of listening to the jobs groups that have been pleading with us to fix this problem sooner rather than later, and end the uncertainty that is acting like a big, wet blanket over our entire economy. Today, another nonpartisan group, the Business Roundtable, urged Congress to adopt the Republican plan to extend current tax law for a year and make a bridge to tax reform. In a letter to Congress, the group's chairman, the Boeing CEO Jim McNerney, warned that, quote, without effective action soon, this uncertainty will spawn a dangerous crisis threatening our economy, businesses, and workers. What Republicans have been saying is that we should eliminate this uncertainty right now. Go on and eliminate it. Eliminate the uncertainty that Boeing employees, nearly 85,000 of whom work in Washington State, and so many others are facing right now. Tackle these problems now rather than waiting until the end of the year. Now, Mr. President, let me just boil it down. Faced with the slowest economic recovery in modern times, chronic joblessness, and the lowest percentage of able-bodied Americans actually participating in the workforce in literally decades, Democrats' one-point plan to revive the economy is this: you earn and we take. You earn and we take. That's apparently the only thing they've got. Surely we can do better. I know we can, and so do the American people. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved, and under the previous order, the time until 12:30 p.m. will be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first 30 minutes and the majority controlling the second 30 minutes.
Mr. President,
Senator from Alabama.
I would thank Senator McConnell for his remarks and the fundamental truth of those remarks, that this administration and the majority in this Senate want to raise taxes. They think by raising taxes and spending more through the government, somehow this will lift the economy. And we've been shown that that's not so. We stayed here last night, our Democrat colleagues did, talking about an issue that doesn't have the support to pass and should have been talking about the fundamentals threats to our economy. Not having a budget, why aren't we moving forward with a budget? Why aren't we moving forward with the appropriations bills that are necessary to fund the government come October 1st? When the Majority Leader, Senator Reid, has announced he has no intention to pass a single one, not even bring them up. So we'll be ending up here in late September passing a CR, a continuing resolution to fund the government. And no telling what else will be tied up in that, creating instability and uncertainty, because this Congress, this Democratic-led Senate, has refused to pass a budget, refused to lay out a plan for the future, refused to move the appropriations bills. I've been here 15 years. This is the first time I've ever seen us not move a single appropriation bill. When I first came, we would move the 13 bills, almost every one of them, before September 30th. It's hard work. You have to bring up the bill, how much you want to defend the Ag Department, the Defense Department, the Education Department, and people offer amendments and debate and do your work. That's what we're supposed to be doing, but we're not. So I wanted to talk today and call attention today to another serious, scandalous, really, development in the way that the Democratic leadership in this Senate is systematically dismantling the statutorily required budget process. And it's a tale and an explanation of how it is we're growing broke. Let me begin with a review of the situation. People need to remember this. Last summer, Congress and the President facing a serious crisis as a result of the fact that surging government spending had driven our debt to the highest level allowed, the debt ceiling. We were hitting the debt ceiling. You remember that. A deal was struck then to raise the debt ceiling. That's what the President wanted. He didn't want to cut spending 40% because we were borrowing and remain borrowing almost 40 cents of every dollar we spend. All government programs would have had to have been cut 40% if we didn't raise the debt ceiling. Amazing as that sounds, what I just said is undisputable. Republicans prevailed in their insistence that spending should be reduced over 10 years by an amount equal to the amount the debt ceiling was raised today, that day, last August. The legislation this deal produced, the Budget Control Act, set certain spending limits on in the absence of any budget resolution that we should have passed as required by law, but had not passed in the Senate. So these spending limits come into effect when the chairman of the Budget Committee, Senator Conrad, files the allocation numbers into the congressional record, telling every Senate Appropriations Subcommittee its allowed spending levels, how much they can spend. That's the power given to the budget chairman. I'm ranking Republican on the budget. Senator Conrad chairs the Budget Committee. So the Budget Control Act plainly dictates that the 2013, that's beginning September 30th of this year, October 1st of this year, spending limits would be derived from the Congressional Budget Office spending baseline. This is crucial because the CBO baseline contains the $2.1 trillion, over 10 years, not all in 1 year, 10-year spending cuts, or really reductions in spending growth, not so much cuts, that the deal was supposed to implement in exchange for the immediate $2.1 trillion raising of the debt ceiling. And so herein lies the scandal. Although it was buried in the spending allocation that Senator Conrad sent out, my staff on the Senate Budget Committee discovered that Senator Conrad did not file an outlay limit based on the CBO baseline. Instead, the outlay total he filed was $14 billion higher, curiously matching exactly the spending levels that President Obama had requested in the budget he submitted to Congress in January. Although this discovery was not readily apparent, Chairman Conrad, to his credit, and he's an honorable man, does not dispute it. He simply asserts that it is within his discretion to unilaterally set a higher total. Again, because the CBO baseline reflects the spending reductions passed by Congress and signed into law, an increase above the baseline, as this allocation that he submitted does, is an abrogation of the deal. It's an abrogation of the agreement we reached in August. Bipartisan, really. And we told the American people, okay, we raised the debt ceiling. A lot of people didn't want to do it. A lot of Americans were hot about it. But we said, well, we're going to cut spending by that much over 10 years. As reported by the publication CQ, quote, Conrad did not counter Sessions' claim that the elevated outlay limit would allow higher spending in fiscal year 2013, close quote. But this is not, let me emphasize, just the fault of Senator Conrad. This large violation of the Budget Control Act is without doubt the decision of Senator Reid, the Democratic leader, his leadership team, and really the members of the Democratic caucus who support him. Remember, outlays are the spending figure which directly registers on the debt. $14 billion in higher outlays in 2013 means $14 billion added to the debt. It's just that simple. In fact, the higher debt that will accrue next year as a result of the higher spending level means that interest payments, the amount of interest we pay on the debt that we accrue, will be greater and will also exceed CBO baseline limits. As a result, the chairman had to also boost spending authority for the Finance Committee by $79 million to compensate for the higher interest payments on the $14 billion added to the debt. This shows that the debt deal legislation has been violated not only in spirit but in letter. Why? Because if you increase discretionary outlays, you increase the debt and therefore increase the interest needed to service the debt. It is crystal clear that the legislation provides no flexibility whatsoever to inflate spending authority for this interest payment. It is in a direct violation of the Budget Control Act of last summer. But he had to do that to justify and to account for the $14 billion increase over the BCA numbers that was agreed to last August. I previously sent 2 letters to Chairman Conrad urging him to correct and refile the proper numbers, but it's evident that the chairman does not intend to do so. So we'll be looking for an alternative course. This is a matter that ought to be considered by the full Senate. And so I plan to pursue a vote on the inflated spending levels. Each senator will therefore have to examine their own conscience and their duty to their constituents, to the nation, to the financial future of our country. Plainly, this action violates the spirit and the terms of the 10-year Budget Control Act plan that was agreed to just last August, just 11 months ago. At that time, Congress declared that we would exercise some spending restraint, $2.1 trillion in reduced spending. It's really a reduce in the growth of spending and does not eliminate all growth in spending. We would go from something like $37 trillion being spent over 10 years to $35 trillion. Not going to break America, but to hear the wails that come about, you would think it would. So the test will be, in this first year since the passage of the debt deal, will we adhere to its modest restrictions, or will we blink? We have members of Congress, and I've raised this issue over the years, that seem to take it as a personal challenge to see how they can spend more money than they're allocated. It happens every year. This is how a country goes broke. The consequences of the annual manipulations and gimmicks cumulatively have great impact over time. These are not small matters. Think about it. This is a chart I put together. Okay, so this year we're adding $14 billion more than agreed to the baseline spending in our country. And this gimmick adds $14 billion to that baseline next year. And so you think, well, it's only $14 billion, Jeff. Calm down. Well, first, Alabama's general fund budget, not including education, is less than $2 billion. $14 billion is a lot of money. We're an average-sized state. But this is how you need to think about these manipulations, because it's very significant as time goes by. If you violate in 2013, next year, the baseline by $14 billion, that goes into the spending level for the next year. And then if next year you violate it again, it's not just $14 billion next year. You're billing $14 billion on top of the $14 billion gimmicked into the spending level this year. It's $28 billion next year, added to the $14 billion we ripped the taxpayers off the previous year. It's $42 billion. You see how that goes up? Each year is adding to it. And we've been doing this kind of thing consistently. And if you just gimmick the budget, $14 billion a year, that's hard to believe, but if you gimmick the budget, $14 billion a year, and I remember doing a chart like this about 10 years ago, and we gimmicked the budget $18 billion that year. And there are probably other gimmicks that we're not referring to. This one gimmick, this one $14 billion gimmick, puts us on a track to add $770 billion to the debt of the United States over 10 years. We have got to adhere to the agreements we make. If we don't stand with those agreements, then we make a mockery of law, we make a mockery of the Senate, we undermine the respect and trust the American people have in us. So you run up $770 billion more, you pay interest on that estimated $112 billion. That $14 billion gimmicked up spending adds $900 billion to the debt. And remember, we are in debt today. So any dollar, every dollar we spend more than what we agreed to is borrowed 100 cents. All of it's borrowed. Any more spending we do is all borrowed because we're in debt now. It's well pushing 40% of the money we spend is borrowed. We spend about $3,700 billion, and we take in about $2,400 billion, and we borrow the rest. It's unsustainable. So meanwhile, the President continues his call for higher taxes, saying that taxing more will reduce the deficit. But his plan is for the new taxes that he's proposed to fund more spending, more gimmicks, and more fraud and waste in government. I know you think that's not so. Surely that's not so. That's not what the President is proposing. But unlike the Democratic Senate, the President did comply with the law and submit a budget, as every President has done since the Budget Act passed in January. He submitted a budget. What did his budget call for? It called for new taxes, all right. It called for $1.8 trillion in new taxes over 10 years. But it also increased spending by 1.6. You see what's happening there, colleagues? The President's proposal is to spend $1.6 trillion in new spending above the Budget Control Act level we agreed to in August. He proposes to wipe out the cuts. He proposes to spend $1.6 trillion more than we agreed to in August, and he pays for it with $1.8 trillion in new taxes. He didn't use his new taxes to pay down the debt. He used the new taxes to fund more government, more spending. That is not what we need to be doing at this point in history. We should have stayed here last night talking about the debt threat to America and not some controversial issue on campaign financing. And for 3 years, 3 consecutive years, this Senate Democratic majority has refused to bring forth a budget plan as required by common sense and law. They refuse even to write a budget and bring it to the floor for consideration. They have no financial plan for the future of America. Senator Reid, what's your plan? He blocked Senator Conrad, who was willing and prepared to lay out a budget plan for the Democrats. He called on him not to do so. And for 3 years, they've not had a budget. We didn't even bring one up this year. They treat any effort to rein in waste and abuse as evidencing hatred for those who are suffering and truly in need. We want to help people in need, but anybody who thinks these programs, like some of the stuff that's coming out now on food stamps, knows that there's waste, fraud, and abuse, and we can clean them up and save money and not hurt people truly in need. from the IRS checks sent to illegal aliens that the Inspector General of the U.S. Treasury Department said has to end, lavish GSA parties in Las Vegas, reckless abuse of the food stamp program, and now this surreptitious $14 billion debt increase. There is no financial accountability in Washington. I'll be working to erase this $14 billion spending increase. It's important. I urge my colleagues to join me so that our actions will be consistent with our promises to the American people made just last August. Otherwise, we are breaching this agreement the first year. So it's always a gimmick and danger, you know, to spend the day and promise to pay for it in the future. Spend more today than the agreement called for, but we're going to pay for it in the future. First year in our agreement is being breached. The best avenue may be to raise a point of order, and we'll look at that and see how to bring this matter before the Senate. I'll be looking for that opportunity, but I really, truly believe it's a defining moment for us. If we can't adhere one full year to the agreement we reached last August, that we told the American people we would abide by, then I think the distrust and lack of confidence already felt in Congress by the American people will continue to further erode. I would thank the chairman and yield the floor.
Mr. President. Senator from Kentucky.
The question remains, should taxpayers be forced to send money overseas to countries that disrespect us? Or more precisely, should we borrow money from China to send it to countries that disrespect us? Should we borrow money from China to send to Pakistan? Should we borrow money from China to send to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt? Should we send good money after bad? For a decade, we searched for bin Laden. We spent hundreds of billions of dollars searching for him. Where did we find him? Not in the remote mountains. We found him living comfortably in the city in Pakistan. We found him living in the middle of this city, not far from a military academy. We were helped in this search by a doctor. A brave doctor in Pakistan by the name of Dr. Shakil Afridi helped us to find bin Laden, helped us with ultimately getting bin Laden. How was he rewarded for this heroism? Where is Dr. Shakil Afridi now? He's been imprisoned by the Pakistani government for 33 years. So for 10 years we searched for bin Laden, high and low, throughout Afghanistan, throughout the world, throughout the mountains. We found him living comfortably in a city only miles from a military academy. And then the doctor who helped us, Pakistan has now imprisoned this doctor for 33 years. So how did the President respond to this? How did President Obama's administration respond to the imprisoning of this doctor, the doctor who helped us get bin Laden? President Obama sent him another $1 billion last week. We already send Pakistan $2 billion and they disrespect us. So what did we do? We sent them another $1 billion. People around this town are bemoaning that there's not enough money for our military, and yet we took $1 billion out of the Defense Department, an extra $1 billion, and sent it to Pakistan last week. Where's Dr. Afridi? In jail for 33 years. I've obtained the signatures necessary to have a vote on this. The leadership doesn't want to allow a vote on this. But I will, one way or another, get a vote on ending aid to Pakistan if they continue to imprison this doctor. He has an appeal that will be heard this Thursday. If he's not successful in his appeal, if he is still imprisoned for life, we will have a vote in the Senate on ending all aid to Pakistan. Not a small portion of their aid, every penny of their aid, including the $1 billion they got last week. We will attempt to stop all aid to Pakistan, and I ask any of the senators here, step forward if you think it's a good idea and tell the American people why you're sending their money to Pakistan. We've got bridges crumbling. We've got roads crumbling. We have schools crumbling in our country, and we're sending money to Pakistan that disrespects us. We spent billions, if not maybe trillions of dollars on the war in Pakistan and Afghanistan trying to get bin Laden. And then the doctor who helps us is now in jail for 33 years. Everywhere I go across this country, in our state, in Kentucky, we have 2 bridges that need to be replaced. We had one that was closed down for 6 months last year in repairs in the middle of one of our major cities. We don't have the money to repair our infrastructure. We're $1 trillion short of money, period. We're borrowing over $1 trillion a year. We now have a $16 trillion debt that equals our entire economy, and yet they're still sending your money to dictators overseas who disrespect us. 80% of the public thinks that this should come to an end. If you ask this question, should we be sending this money overseas when we have difficulty and needs and wants at home, 80% of the public will say it should end, and yet when you force this body to vote, 80% of your representatives are for sending more aid overseas. They're all clamoring and clapping their hands. Last week, when President Obama said he sent another $1 billion overseas, they all stand up and clap. I don't think the American taxpayer is clapping. I don't think the American taxpayer is happy that we're $1 trillion in a hole and still sending this money overseas to countries that disrespect us. What I say to Pakistan is, if you want to be our ally, act like it. If you want to be our ally, respect us. If you want to be our ally, work with us on the war on terrorism. But if you want to be our ally, don't hold Dr. Afridi, don't hold political prisoners, don't hold people who actually are working with us to get bin Laden. I will do everything within my power to have this vote. They don't want to have this vote. They'd like foreign aid up here. They all love it. They love sending your money overseas, but they don't want to vote on it. So they've been blocking this vote. And they will attempt to block my vote, but I have the signatures necessary, and you will see me on the floor next week. If Dr. Afridi is still in jail next week, I will make them vote on this, because it's the least that you deserve. The taxpayers deserve to know, why are your senators voting to send your money overseas when we're $1 trillion in the hole? Why are your senators voting to send billions of dollars to Pakistan when they imprison the guy who helped us get bin Laden? This is unconscionable. It has to stop. The debt is a threat to our country. It's a threat to the republic. And I will do everything I can to force a vote on this, and then the American people can decide. You can decide if you want to keep sending these people back to Washington who are sending your money overseas to people who have no respect for us. So I will do everything in my power to have this vote, and we will record the Senate. Your representatives will be recorded on whether or not they want to continue to send your money to Pakistan while Pakistan imprisons this doctor who helped us get bin Laden. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
President.
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, let me begin. I have 6 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I would ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, for several weeks now, I've spoken here on the Senate floor urging my colleagues of both parties to extend the wind production tax credit, or as it's known, the PTC, and the presiding officer has had the opportunity to listen to me on a number of occasions. I thank you for your attention and interest and support. I'm here again this morning to continue my work because I don't want to lose one more American job because of our failure, Congress's failure to act. And I also want to assure, as I know the presiding officer does, that we, the United States, remains competitive in the global clean energy economy. Today, I want to talk specifically about the PTC's impact on the state of Utah, one of America's fastest growing wind energy producers. Like other western states, including my home state of Colorado, Utah's geography and climate makes it an ideal location for wind production. It's estimated that if fully utilized, Utah's wind resources, Mr. President, could provide up to 132% of the state's current electricity needs. Think about that. The entire state's electricity needs could be met by wind power alone. If you look at the map of Utah that is displayed here, Mr. President, you'll see that the largest wind projects are located in Beaver and Millard counties. They're in western Utah. And in those two counties, the First Wind Corporation has constructed the Milford Wind Project. This project produces enough electricity to power over 64,000 homes, avoids 300,000 tons of CO2 emissions, and provides good-paying jobs to hundreds of hardworking Utahns. Now, beyond the obvious and the enormously positive effect the Milford Wind Project has had on job creation in Utah's environment, it's also been an economic boon to the surrounding rural communities. Beaver County's tax base has increased so much that it allowed for a new elementary school to be built without any tax increases to local residents. And in effect, Mr. President, those tax receipts replaced a school that had really fallen into disrepair. This project has brought more than $50 million in economic benefits to Utah as a whole, created over 300 on-site jobs during construction, and engaged more than 60 local Utah businesses throughout construction and development. That is a win-win-win-win-win situation, no matter how you calculate it. But, Mr. President, only if we extend the wind PTC will we continue to see the investment, the job creation, and the economic growth like Utah has seen in recent years. So now is the time for us to act, to preserve and create thousands of jobs, and to usher in a clean energy future for the American people. Without our support, the growth of the wind energy industry will slow, and in fact, wind energy producers likely will shed jobs and halt projects. An article published just this week in the Wall Street Journal, Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent that the article be included in the record.
Without objection.
That article suggests that if Congress does not vote to extend the PTC, my own state of Colorado stands to lose hundreds, possibly thousands of jobs. And that's just one state. Nationally, the numbers are much higher, with estimates suggesting we could lose as many as 30,000 jobs. So the PTC is a perfect example of how Congress can play a positive, productive role in encouraging economic growth and supporting American manufacturing. The American people expect us to do everything we can to create jobs and economic growth. They expect us to work across the political aisle and produce results. They deserve results, and we should not disappoint them by succumbing to election year gridlock. We have a solid base of bipartisan support for wind energy and for the passage of the wind PTC. That's why I've been urging my colleagues to work with me to pass it as soon as possible. From Colorado and Utah to Rhode Island and beyond, the PTC has helped American families and businesses prosper in a time when other industries have faltered. The wind industry has been one of the few industries of real growth in recent years, and it has so much more potential. Americans have said again and again that they want Congress to extend the wind PTC. Let's not let them down. Our economy and our future depend on it. Let's pass the PTC as soon as possible. It equals jobs. Mr. President, I'll be back on the floor tomorrow to keep fighting for this common sense policy. Coloradans expect no less. Let's pass the production tax credit as soon as possible and protect American jobs. Mr. President, if I might, I'd like to turn to another topic that's on everybody's minds, and that's the efforts here in the United States Senate to reform the way in which our campaigns are financed and the way in which that information is shared with the public. Many of my colleagues took to the floor last night to discuss the importance of the Disclose Act and to draw attention to the enormous volume of undisclosed money that's now flowing into this campaign season and into those campaigns. The democracy is strengthened by casting light on Spending and Elections Act, or as it's known in its shorter form, the Disclose Act, is an important step forward. It was conceived as a response to the U.S. Supreme Court's 2010 Citizens United decision. And many of us have watched with deep concern as the consequences of that decision play out this election season. Unlimited and often secret contributions to organizations known as super PACs are pouring into our election system and literally drowning out the voices of ordinary Americans who don't happen to be millionaires or billionaires. And instead of a system where candidates exchange ideas and share their vision for a more prosperous country, the Citizens United decision has unleashed a relentless array of attack ads. And the American people have no idea where they're coming from or who is footing the bill. And this sort of unlimited and secret influx of cash is raising the specter of corruption in our elections. And frankly, Mr. President, I'm worried that we're entering an era of politics that we haven't seen since the Watergate scandal of some 40 years ago. There is hope, however, because despite what I thought was a misguided decision tied to Citizens United, the Supreme Court did uphold Congress's power to require transparency when it comes to those unlimited campaign dollars. And so the Disclose Act was born. And let me share with the viewers what the Disclose Act would do. It would require that super PACs, corporations, labor unions, and other independent groups file a public disclosure with the Federal Election Commission for any campaign-related disbursement of over $10,000 or more within 24 hours of the expenditure. This basic requirement is designed to bring the exchange of these secret campaign dollars out of the shadows so Coloradans and all the American people know who is trying to influence our elections. That's it. It's simple and it makes sense. We're only asking that political spending and funding be disclosed and held to the same standard as traditional political action committees and candidate expenditures. This sensible requirement will not create burdensome regulations or be in conflict with any of the holdings of the Supreme Court. It's the kind of common sense transparency that Coloradans are calling for. It might sound cliche, but sunlight is truly the best disinfectant. In fact, I heard the leader of our caucus, Senator Reid, mention that the Republican leader, Senator McConnell, had used that same concept. Sunlight is truly the best disinfectant. And we literally stomp on the basic principles of democracy when we allow tens of millions of dollars to be secretly spent on our elections. And I want to emphasize that this should not be a partisan issue. Despite last night's vote, you would think we could all surely agree on transparency. For example, our colleague, Senator McCain, has lamented that without reform and transparency, the Citizens United decision could lead to a major campaign finance scandal. And of course, that's not healthy for our democracy. The Supreme Court affirmed Congress's authority to require disclosure, so let's do our job to protect democracy and bring sunlight to our elections. Let's bring the Disclose Act forward and pass it right away. I also know, Mr. President, many Americans would like to see us overturn the effects of Citizens United altogether, and there are efforts to do exactly that. For example, Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico has introduced a constitutional amendment that would give Congress the power to regulate political spending. I support that effort. I also support an effort to change the way in which we fund presidential elections. And I've introduced legislation, the Presidential Funding Act, that would reform the currently outdated presidential public finance system. It's a bill that's aimed at preserving the voices of average Americans. In 1974, the presidential public campaign finance system was developed in an effort to restore public faith in elected officials after the Watergate scandal, and it's been used in nearly every presidential election since. By establishing public financing, we allow candidates to compete based on their ideas instead of competing on who has the most support from special interests and deep-pocketed donors. In fact, my father, Congressman Morris Udall, who served in the House representing the 2nd District in Arizona for some 30 years, was actually one of the first to use the public financing system, which he had helped craft 2 years prior when he ran for the Democratic nomination in 1976. My father was a big believer in running for office on behalf of his constituents instead of on behalf of big money. And I believe strongly that that ethos ought to apply to today's elected officials more than ever. The public financing system funded candidates for 30 years and has enriched the political discourse of the country by ensuring that the American people have more sway than connected insiders, special interests, or wealthy donors. Unfortunately, the current system's inability to keep up with the enormous spending required in presidential campaigns has rendered it less effective. And thanks to Citizens United, public financing is no longer a viable option to compete against unlimited special interest dollars. My legislation would strengthen the public financing system and incentivize candidates to obtain support from actual citizens, not special interest super PACs or secret financiers. It would ensure that our proven public financing system would be available for future elections and that corporate and special interest money don't drown out genuine ideas and debates in our presidential elections. So for those of us who are committed to fixing our campaign finance system in the wake of Citizens United, there is a lot of challenging work ahead. But I know that Coloradans agree with me that reform could be the single most important issue that fix the way our democracy functions. As I've suggested and as we know, Mr. President, unfortunately, federal elections are increasingly about who can secretly appeal more to wealthy and special interests instead of working to improve the lives of average and hardworking Americans. This sows corruption, dysfunction, and a government that is less responsive to the needs of the people. Today we have an opportunity to start with a sensible requirement that we should all be able to agree on. Disclosure is nothing to be afraid of. So I urge my colleagues to reconsider their vote and to allow the Senate to at least debate the Disclose Act. We cannot afford to let another filibuster stand in the way of fair and open campaigns. Let's pass the Disclose Act and take a big step towards turning the power of our government back over to the American people. Mr. President, thank you for your attention. I yield the floor. I note that the leader of this important effort, the Disclose Act, Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island, is on the floor. I want to thank him for his leadership and for his commitment to ensuring that it's the American people that determine our future, not special interests, super PACs, and millionaires and billionaires and financiers who leave no track, no trace of where their money is going or where it's come from. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President, I thank the distinguished senator from Colorado for his impassioned and eloquent support of this. I think we both recognize that through the course of our country's history, men and women have shed their blood, have laid down their lives in order to protect this experiment in liberty that is the ongoing gift of our country to the rest of the world. And when we take that experiment in liberty and turn it over to the special interests, it is a grave occasion. I see the majority leader is on the floor. If I could take one moment as he comes to the podium to ask unanimous consent that for the duration of today's session, Alex Link, Rob Famigletti, and Samantha Freeman, who are fellows on my Judiciary Committee staff, be granted floor privileges. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Indian Affairs be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 205 and that we now proceed to the consideration of that measure.
Clerk will report.
H.R. 205, an act to amend the act titled, An Act to Authorize the Leasing of Restricted Indian Lands for Public, Religious, Educational, Recreational, Residential, Business, and other purposes, requiring the grant of long-term leases and so forth and other purposes.
Mr. President.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask that the bill be read a third time passed, motion reconsider be laid on the table, there be no intervening action or debate. Any statements relating to this matter be printed in the record at the appropriate place as if read.
Without objection.
President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I believe that